I think they overplayed their hand, the Democrats. It's not my area of expertise, but it might be yours, about how the Democratic Party works, about who the various interest groups are, about when they get into positions of administrative responsibility, they allow their ideological commitments to color how they, deploy their portfolio, about what the campaign organizers are telling the elected officials about what they need to do and how they need to message and how they need to appeal to the various segments of the electorate and whatnot.
When people talk about these grants getting cut off, what they say is the Biden administration required us to put in components that were DEI specific and or targeted towards addressing concerns in the LGBTQ community in order to get the money. You're going to hear that, whether you're going to hear it in public or you're going to hear it in private. That is the case. So there were strings attached under a Democratic, quote unquote, liberal, progressive administration to having research money at institutions. So the Trump administration is canceling all of those grants. So what is your assessment of the balance between a Democratic administration or a Republican administration and the relationship it has to funding education? Haven't liberals and progressives tried to push higher education in a direction with its funding in a way now that the Trump administration is doing by withdrawing that funding?
Well, the problem is that if the funding is conditioned in that way, then it can be misinterpreted as a way of tacitly making being white a disadvantage. And that's what we've seen too often. The idea being that we're not supposed to use anyone white at all, especially if they're a man. Because once you do that, then the whole issue of merit gets basically turned on its head. That's a major aspect of this, whether it led to that. Sometimes it led to that because people were being too cautious. Sometimes it led to it because there's a certain kind of person whose sense of social justice is that now it's non-white people's turn. And you would have to ask, well, for how long? Some of them, I guess, would say for 400 years, but it's now our turn. And therefore, the white man shouldn't get the job. And that's, of course, a rather unhumanizing and short-sighted way of thinking. But that's a lot of what these pre-Trump initiatives ended up leading to, even if that wasn't the idea, especially after March of 2020, when we entered into a new mood because of a cocktail of sociological factors that could not have been predicted, but that we're living with the legacies of since.
Yeah, right? I don't disagree with anything John said. I think they overplayed their hand, the Democrats. I think, again, it's not my area of expertise, but it might be yours, about how the Democratic Party works, about who the various interest groups are, about how they, when they get into positions of administrative responsibility, they allow their ideological commitments to color how they, deploy their portfolio, about what the campaign organizers are telling the elected officials about what they need to do and how they need to message and how they need to appeal to the various segments of the electorate and whatnot. I mean, I don't know how many federal judges Joe Biden appointed, but I assure you that the proportion of them who were Black women is vastly in excess of the proportion of Black women in the relevant demographic because, you're appointing federal judges and you want Black women. Joe Biden ran for president telling us that he was going to appoint a woman and a Black woman, his running mate and so on and so on. And that the politics of that kind of pandering, which is contemptible. I mean, Black people are so stupid that they'll be led around by the nose by you waving a shiny object of, we appointed these Black people to this thing and we got this DEI thing, but, really? But that would take us off point. We were talking about universities.
Glenn, though, just for the record, there's a person who would say that, Glenn, you should know, when we do this online, I always give this person a name. I'm not going to do that here. It doesn't feel right. But her name is Beverly. Okay. And Beverly is a Black woman of stature in this life. And she tells you, Glenn, she's praying. Glenn, you ought to know.
She's called Stacey Abrams, but go ahead.
She's not. She's Constant Baker Motley's daughter. And she said, you ought to know that there was a time when someone like me had no hope of getting any higher than XYZ. Here we are. It's only been about 10 minutes. And frankly, it's our turn. Don't you think it's our turn? Yes, it's disproportionate, but it's our turn for the chance. And do you think that all of those white male judges before, named Potter and things like that, were all equally competent and geniuses? Some of the Supreme Court justices were frankly even kind of dumb back in the 50s. That's what.
Yeah, to which there's an answer. Two wrongs don't make a right is the first answer. But the second answer is the year is 2025, not 1975. You better watch out. The backlash is coming. You think people don't hear you? You think they don't know what's going on? It's ironic beyond belief that it was non-white, non-black plaintiffs who brought affirmative action down. The country is moving on. The world is moving on. You're still playing the Jim Crow card?
So do you give no credence to lived experiences? I mean, it's a real question. So when you think about, DEI, you think about anti-Semitism, you think about the Trump administration's manipulation of these concepts to divide people based on identity or lived experience or historical experience. Do you not think a black female judge is going to take any kind of case that comes in her courtroom with a different perspective than a white male judge? Do we really think lived experiences do not inform the adjudication in any space?
Well, yeah, lived experience do, but race is not a good substitute for lived experience.
Anymore.
Really? And gender isn't either?
Really? Well,
I would say gender more than race. We're all thinking about Ketanji Brown Jackson, for example. She is younger than me, went to school at a time that I remember. I remember what race was like, and she does a great job. But in terms of her lived experience as a black person who grew up rather comfortable with lots of experience with white people who were very, very well-meaning, the occasional racist thing, they certainly happened to me in my life, but not enough, I would say, for that to constitute a lived experience that would be especially relevant to jurisprudence. Not enough. There's this much that you're supposed to decide on. This much will be about race. And in terms of, I have nothing against her, but we have to use real people. It's not Beverly. In terms of her lived experience in the 1980s, 90s, aughts, and teens, I don't think it's enough to make that decision worth it. It's just that having the occasional scrape with racism or having been somewhat less affluent than most of the people around you, I don't call that a lived experience relevant to jurisprudence. I call that just something that distinguishes you from some other people. I know that sounds ice cold, but I wouldn't say it in 1950, but I'm saying it in 2025.
And would you extend that to all professions, college professors, construction workers, lawyers, doctors, across the board?
Yes. And I'm flying by the seat of my pants, but yes, especially because these days, white people are not fountains of informativeness necessarily, but they are much more sensitive to these things, especially in the settings that we're often talking about, which is not all of those, than they used to be. And so, for example, some of the most insightful comments about inequality that I hear in my classes come from very white kids, which was not true when I was my college student's age. But progress happens. It's easier to say it doesn't happen than to admit that it happens slowly. So I would say, flying by the seat of my pants, there must be one profession where there's an exception. But in general, yes.
Yeah, let me add to that. Stereotyping. I see the person, I see their race, I see their exogamy, I see what their skin color is and what their hair texture is. And I think I know something about them, lived experience. So I impute to them a certain set of presumptions about how their lives have gone, which may or may not be accurate about those particular individuals. Or let me flip the script, not say the lived experience of a black person. Let me say the lived experience of a white person. If I were you, I'd feel very uncomfortable having anybody making any assumptions about how I experience life based upon the fact that I'm white. How superficial can you get? I mean, everybody's got a story. And sometimes the ethical force of the story is entirely driven by the fact that it's counter the narrative. The white working class person who struggles or whatever, or the wealthy privileged person who deals with drug addiction and all the other kind of pitfalls and snares and has to come to terms with, what their human condition is. So that we oughtn't to dwell on the racialized lived experience presumptions. We might not ignore them, but we oughtn't to live there. We ought to be casting our vision higher. We ought to be trying to think about universalism. We ought to be thinking about the human condition.
Glenn, do you really mean, this is a genuine question, do you mean that we shouldn't ignore them? Because I was waiting for you to really push it against.
Well, like Justice Roberts says in his opinion, where he says it's an out, really, he says, you're going to write an essay and you're going to tell me about your life. And if race happens to come up as a part of you telling me the story about your life and it's relevant to your story, okay, I'll hear you out. But I'm not going to presume anything about you in virtue of the fact that you simply cited your race or checked the box. I'm against that. And he thinks the Constitution is against that kind of racial stereotyping when you're dispersing public benefits.